Hey, hello! Welcome to Business Coder. Today we are going to discuss how actually block websites on our Macs on Windows using Node.js and pretty simple principle with working with strings. If you remember, we are building an application just to block any unnecessary websites that you're usually visiting when you are working, when you should working actually, but you are just typing that instantly without thinking about it. For example, Facebook, Twitter, or something like that. Specifically, like it's relates to social media, but it definitely we are going to give a flexibility on user end what kind of sites he want to block when he's working during work times. So let's jump to the code and understand what we are building. It's pretty simple, but the main purpose of this content is just to understand how the website blocking itself works. If you remember from our last videos, we have built this UI, which represents the main functionality that our time blocker app will give, which means that we'll have websites that we're going to block with a certain amount of time zones, which call the entire like Pomodoro principle. So this website blacklist should be like editable, and today we're just going to understand how we are going to block that on our backend side. It is totally Node.js code, and it based on the Electron.js engine. Of course, we are not using the actual Electron functionality there because Node.js functionality is totally fine there. We are not going to make any more complicated that stuff. It's pretty simple to do. So for every operating system, there is a file called hosts. On a Windows, it's located a little bit far away from user end and inside the system 32 files. So if you are on a Mac or on a Linux, it will be the same direction for you as I'll type here. But on if you are on a Windows, it is a little bit different. I'll show in a minute. But generally, file look the same, and the work principle is the same. If you are typing something there and pointing to an IP address, instead of resolving that on your network environment DNS, it will just go straight to your provided IP address. It just helps in terms of system configuration, sometimes just to point some domain names to your local IP address in order just to test, for example, HTTPS certificates, or even when you don't have that configuration on your dev environment, but you want to access that in production like a state where you have to have that domain. So it is more of a used in that purposes, but of course we can just block websites by typing their domain name, pointing that to our local host. And because we actually don't host the Facebook itself, it is most likely going to lock here and will just give us an error page like this. For example, if I'll just hit, and it will say that I can't resolve because I don't have any HTTPS servers running on my machine, but Facebook itself trying to point on HTTPS domain, which of course will fail. In that sense, we can actually type any domain name, point that to our local host address, and have that blocked. So that simple principle will just be useful for our application because it's just that simple. It works on any platform, and we don't need any kind of like networking functionality there. We don't have to write any sniffers or proxy servers. We just have to update the host file itself. Our main folder structure looks like this. If you haven't checked our previous videos where we'll discussing everything that you can see right now here, and as a reference point, we got working a system tray application with the Electron, which is going to be our main touching point for the next couple of videos. Okay, so for this particular case, we are actually going to have a separate file for having blocking functionality inside our Electron folder, because it is based fully on Node.js. It involves some UI work when we'll have a button that will say, hey, block these websites, but that communication will go more on a UI side. But here, for this video particularly, we are going just to make a file which will have that functionality for blocking hosts. So for this, let's make a file called hosts blocker, and that file is actually will be some kind of a helper functionality, host blocker, that we are going to use from our Electron based renderer, and we will call that functions. So for this purpose, we are going to make just an expert functions, helper functions, and let's actually make another helpers. I'm using this principle for a while. Every time when I need some very small functions that I'm going to use probably in multiple places, I'm just making a helpers file, which then I'm importing on like many places. It just helps to keep your code cleaner. So here we have to understand how we're going to work with files, because in multiple systems, working with files could be pretty different. For example, on Windows, we don't have a /n only for end of file. So for that particular case, we have to consider, because for our host file, we have every record in a new line, and for splitting over lines, we have to have understanding which operating system we are currently in. So for getting that information, for Node.js, there's a helper, I'll say, global environment variable, which tells which operating system we are right now. And for end of line, we can use if we are on a Windows /r/n, and for rest of the operating systems like Unix and Mac, we are going to use a /n only, which is a default format for that. So for this host blocker file, first of all, we actually need the host file path, which differs from system to system, because on Windows there is a host file located inside system32, and on the rest of the operating systems it is etc hosts, but the functionality is the same. So file format and functionality is the same, which is pretty cool, because like not every OS based API is that much simple for reusing on other places. So secondly, because the host file is actually a simple text format. We don't have any kind of parsing mechanism there. We just know that every single line represents the actual host's record that we want to append or delete if we want to add or remove from the host file. And because of that, we have to have some kind of a marks for our application specifically, just to mark that, then find that places where is located our records. For that, I'm just using like pretty simple, just text marks, time blocker start and time blocker end, which I'm assuming will be unique. There is no application probably that going to use this format, and we wouldn't have like any issues with that. So secondly, let's just add some predefined domains that we wanna block in terms of like testing. This is totally testable. Later on, when we will have full application UI connected to this, of course we are going to keep that domains inside some kind of a local storage, then pass that to our Node.js application side. So the main function actually looks something like this. I have predefined code snippets here. So main function for blocking, we actually have to receive domain names, read file, find our indexes, and then replace that with the actual provided domain names. And we are assuming here that we could already have some domain names written there, and for the second time when we're thinking to block again, we just have to prepend or append to a specific list that we already have in our host file. And for the actual content creation for host file, we just combining everything together. For example, if we got domains that are already blocked and we got domains that we want to block, we just concatenating that arrays with the spread, getting the existing information that we don't care about because it's not our application side there, and we are basically just joining that with end of line. That's it. So that's like pretty simple string manipulation. And of course I have here a lot of helper functions like read host file, which reads and splits that with end of lines and then returns the actual array that we are getting. But it is just a simple small helper functions that's more of a like useful in terms of combining a simple step like this. Okay, so for this particular case, we also have a function which will basically unblock that. So whenever there's a timer starts and timer ends, we are going to unblock that. And for unblocking, it is a reverse operation that we have to do. So we have to get our host file content. We have to split that with end of line just to get a full JavaScript array of lines for our host file. And we have to find our positions where our block of time blocking and starts and ends, and within that period we have to just remove everything and then again join this host file with end of line to get a final result for our host file as it was looking originally before we have touched even. So for that, we are using the main functionality is finding a position, which is obviously like pretty simple. We have a string marks, and whenever we are getting our string mark found, then we are just marking, hey, this is the position inside that array, that the index actual for the lines, which represents our starting mark for time blocker application. And then after having start and end, we basically splicing that just to get the final array, cutting from host file itself, and then making the manipulations. The same principle is for adding. We are basically splicing that, then concatenating with the new domain names, and then all of that joining with the end of line to get the final host file result. That's it. That's the most simplest way to implement. Of course, we have to consider here the error messages itself that we could potentially get, but it is more of a UI kind of implementation where UI will require, for example, to pop up a message, and we will provide this from this function whenever it is required or not. So for blocking and unblocking, it is actually Boolean return type, which means if it returns false, then it's the operation wasn't successful. If from UI we have to have a specific message why it was not successful, we'll do that. But first assumption is that user for this particular application is not technical, which means we don't have to provide a specific reason in terms of like technical definition why this operation is failed. So in terms of like testing, it is going to be a pretty simple one. Let's just write first step is just to block that domains, which means that we are going to add that domains to our host file, and then we are just going to unblock that just to see if we'll get the final result here. So this, because this is not yet integrated to a UI and not connected to any Electron processes, it's just a plain Node.js file. I'm just going to use TS Node, which is TypeScript interpreter and compiler for a simple usage. So I'm going to run hosts blocker file just to block websites. Okay, this one is crashed. Oh, okay, so I'm missing a lot of imports here. Let's just make it, okay, it's just fs. Yeah, this is pretty common issue here. So when I will run this, I'll get another error, but that's completely different because it says that I don't have permission to write to host file. The thing is that host file is protected with the root permission or sudo permission. And on Windows, it's called administrative permission. So whenever we are going to start our application, we have to have some kind of a Mac or Windows configuration to tell an operating system that our desktop application is going to work as an administrator permission account. On Mac it is going to work as a sudo, so user have to provide that. So if you familiar with any kind of application that uses your system resources, Mac or Windows asks you by popping up a window for that. This will also happen like this if we will have a specific configuration for our Electron file. And for this particular case, let's just type a sudo because anyway we'll have that configuration. Okay, after completing this, let's just check our host file, what we get there. Okay, here is the time blocker start, time blocker end, and our domain names which are going to be blocked. And of course, let's just remove. So for removing, we have a reverse function for that, uncommenting that and running that again. Okay, let's check. Okay, we don't have anything. So our main functionality worked, but if you remember from the last run, when we tried to block here, we actually got not the same formatting here. For example, we have IP address, space, and a domain name just to block, but we only got here domain names, which is pretty simple. We just have to concatenate the same string, which is going to be our local address string for every item inside the blocking line. So let's just add here for the domains. We are going to map that, and each domain should be like this. It even doesn't matter what kind of IP address you will write, unless it is the same IP address, but you can type anything, even invalid IP address, just to fail that. We're typing our local address, just considering that it will be always available. Okay, so after adding this, we'll get our nice blocking websites with the actual IP addresses, and not just only the domain names list, which is probably not the formatting that the host file is using. And after trying another time, we'll get this nice thing which will actually block that websites. For example, if I'll try to enter one of these websites, for example Twitter, it's blocked because we just added that to our host file. And the same with YouTube. Again, it blocked. So that's probably it for this video. Later on, we will integrate this functionality, and for completing our app, we don't have actually outstanding any major functionality. We just have to build our UI and connect that to this one. And yep, that's it for today. If you have any questions relating to this code or how the hosts or DNS works itself, just write on the comments below. I'll make another video more detailed with more detailed explanation. But for now, don't forget to subscribe and hit that like button. That helps a lot to keep my motivation on this.